Hello, and welcome to Good and Decent, a Grotto podcast. Episode 18, Death Row Sister.
Terre Haute, Indiana. It's a town with a population just shy of 60,000 on the Illinois-Indiana border, about an hour and 15 minutes west of Indianapolis. It's a quaint town, home to Vigo County's Stoic Courthouse, several small museums, and a beautiful historic movie theater. But just outside of town sits something more ominous. The Special Confinement Unit of a United States Penitentiary. It's the only place where the federal government puts people to death. Another structure just outside of town is the spacious St. Mary of the Woods campus, where the Sisters of Providence reside. With federal death row in such close proximity, several of the sisters have become involved ministering to prisoners. One of those sisters is Sister Barbara. She's been a companion to several men who have since been executed. Often she's the only one allowed in the death chamber the moments leading up to a prisoner's execution. This experience has shaped her view on the death penalty, humanity, and what forgiveness really means. Grotto correspondent Katie Rutter interviewed Sister Barbara on a car ride to and from the penitentiary. The following is that conversation.
So I think the first thing I'm looking for context right now, because people aren't going to know you, they aren't going to know what you do, and they probably won't even know what happens in Terre Haute. So, describe let me ask two. Would you call yourself a spiritual advisor, a spiritual companion? What term would you use?
The Bureau of Prison calls it minister of record. I wouldn't call myself a spiritual, I'd call it more like a spiritual companion.
Can you describe what a spiritual companion is and who you're ministering to, right? Especially for the people who don't even know we're in Terre Haute and don't know about the federal prison.
Yeah, so over the years I have been a spiritual companion to several guys on our federal death row here in Terre Haute, Indiana. That's at the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, the one and only place where the federal government puts people to death. And so, as you might imagine, to be incarcerated in a high security, basically in isolation for years on end, the guys have quite an opportunity to do some soul searching, to do some reflecting, and it's, in fact, it's part of our legal system and our laws in this country that they have to have access to faith leaders from their denomination, from their faith tradition, to walk with them, to companion them, to support them. And so over the years, many Sisters of Providence have served in that capacity. I just happen to be the one doing it now.
What is those describe what does that entail and what those meetings kind of look like? How often, where, what's the security like? Yeah, so the row, as it's known, federal death row, the technical term for that place is the Special Confinement Unit. These guys are basically in solitary confinement. The only physical contact they have, the only contact visits they have are with their lawyers. If their family comes, their minister comes to see them, it's through a glass, on a phone. More recently, you don't have to hold the phone. It's a little more technologically savvy. So to get to where they are, though, is probably 20 minutes worth of security, like going through TSA on steroids. Because then you get wanded and you get picture taken, and then after you pass all of that, you get walked through several, locked doors, as any prison has, those big metal clanging doors. You get walked to the visiting rooms. And the person I'm visiting is in 4-point shackles. He's walked there by, I think, I forget if it's 2 or 4 guards have to walk him there. I mean, that's how high of a security operation it is.
Do you walk in knowing what the conviction was?
So those are, the conviction is a matter of public record.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, I learn what the man I'm companioning wants to tell me. I don't go looking for their trial record, their arrest warrant, the nature of their crime. I don't necessarily avoid that, and I learn about it, but that's not like one of my top things I do before I start meeting with somebody. I currently am not meeting with anyone myself, though I've hooked up one person, a sister from Central Illinois, to come and visit with one of the guys. Another one of the guys I was companioning, his sentence did get commuted to life without parole, so therefore he was moved. I think he's in Texas now. My main role now is to facilitate family and loved ones visiting their loved one on death row.
In the past you said you accompanied men to the death chamber, is that right?
Yes, I did.
What kind of, describe the kind of mental, both the prep and what you're thinking through that.
It's hard to describe what went through my mind and my heart when the first guy who asked me, this was Keith Nelson, he asked me through another Sister of Providence who has since gone home to God, who herself, Betty Donahue, longtime companion, guide, minister to several guys on death row. Anyway, through Betty, Keith asked me if I would be with him in the death chamber. And first of all, to just kind of imagine, who among us knows the minute and hour that we're going to be put to death? Knows ahead of time. And then to have somebody ask me, who we hadn't met yet, however, he'd been watching what the Sisters of Providence are doing. We're very vocal advocates to abolish the death penalty. He sees our work in the newspaper and on TV. So he sought me out. And what went through my mind and my heart was, oh, of course I want to do it. And then almost right away it's like, ooh, could I do it? Could I stand there? Could I not want to intervene? Could I? I'm a healthcare professional. I'm licensed. I have a code of ethics that says, do what you can to preserve life. So I prayed about it. It was, and of course I spoke to the sister, my superior, the sister that I'm accountable to. And I said, of course I want to do this. And we'll figure it out together. Me and God and the person I'm companioning, Keith, it's a solemn, I would say, gift and responsibility to be with that man when he couldn't have his loved ones with him. They wouldn't allow that. He couldn't have anybody related to him in that death chamber. It has to be a minister or nobody.
When you're kind of going through these meetings leading up to it or companioning, are you thinking of anything in you personally? Are you thinking of anything in particular, or what's the mental prep you're going through?
So, in preparing to meet both with Keith and then a month later I was with Will, my prayer, my preparation, my spirit was focused on, here's another human being in need. As sisters, we profess vows: poverty, chastity, obedience. We live a common life that's all about supporting the common good, being of service. We talk about our vow formula talks about a life of service. My constitutions of the Sisters of Providence talk about extending God's love, mercy, and justice. So those weeks preparing to be with both Keith and then eventually with Will were really sacred time for me. Now it was in the midst of a killing spree. The government killed 13 persons over 6 months during the former president's term. So I also was the lead organizer for the actual protests, demonstrations, vigils, whatever you want to call them. They're really a combination of all three of those at the penitentiary each time there was an execution. But in the midst of that, it was really profound, grace-filled time for me to give myself in that way.
I mean, we talked a little bit about you, but let's talk about the men, right? When they're asking for a spiritual companion, you know, and can you give context for me too? Like in a federal prison, when they're asking for a spiritual companion, like what are they looking for, right? What do they want?
And you know, I've several other persons were spiritual companions to the guys being executed at that time, and there was one woman, so it was 12 men and one woman executed. So one of the guys, he's a Unitarian Universalist minister. He knew the man he was companioning. He'd been with him for a little while, visiting with him. Keith, I only met him about 10 days before the execution. When I met with him, he was really clear what he wanted. He wanted the world to know what happens in that death chamber. He wanted the curtain to be pulled back. He wanted me to do whatever I could to speak about it, to bring awareness to the violence, the horrendous nature of what our government does to these guys. They're essentially in solitary confinement, 23 and a half hours a day. Some of them for 20 years. It's amazing when you think about it that they even have maintained any semblance of sanity, of a good self-concept, of some mental stability, and some have not. It can be an awful, awful situation. So that's what Keith wanted. Will, on the other hand, Will had done a lot of spiritual questioning. He'd had some very faithful, loving companions. These are women and men in France. He called them his French grandmothers. It's an association of Christians against torture. And they were in regular contact with him by letter. And Will said to me, "It will be such a solace for my mother to know that you're there, to know that you'll anoint my body, to know that you're praying with me." As it happened, his mother lives somewhere in the middle part of the country. She was not there at the execution. She could not be there. Although she was allowed to, she could not come and watch that happen. So for Will, it was a matter of he wanted certain prayers prayed. It was a spiritual comfort to him and to his mother for me to be there.
Do you think these men, the men either you personally are accompanied or the other men on federal death row, do you think they want forgiveness?
You know, it's interesting. Will talks about what he taught me is he felt like they were never going to be forgiven because they were pushed aside, labeled, named, ostracized, described as evil, totally unforgivable. That was his experience of what society does when they put you on death row. However, he knows, from his writings, from our conversation, from his last words, he knows, that human nature is such that we're always evolving. And who, and especially not our God, does not judge us on the worst thing we've done ever in our life. There's always room for repentance and reconciliation and forgiveness. Now, does that come from the parents or the victim family members? Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. And yet, like Will, who I would describe as spiritually mature, recognize that even if it doesn't necessarily, forgiveness doesn't necessarily come from the family members, it still comes. It comes from his God, it comes from the rest of us, it comes from other humans that recognize that human condition, the frailty. That God's love, we're never, ever beyond God's love. And Will said that to me. I'm not just like quoting my own philosophy or my own belief, which it is my belief, but he recognized that too. It's really a paradox. Our government wants to put people to death to try to send a message that killing people is wrong, so therefore the way they're sending that message is killing people. It makes no sense.
So do you think that Will really believed he was forgiven? He had received forgiveness?
Oh, yes. He asked me to pray the Divine Mercy Chaplet while we were in the death chamber together. The Divine Mercy Chaplet that asks God, that implores God's mercy and asks for forgiveness for the whole world, not just for him, for all of us. He quoted Thomas Merton talking about that we're all members of the human family, and we're all just learning how to become more human every day. So starting in the summer of 2020, the federal government began a killing spree where they executed 13 persons over a 6-month period. I accompanied 2 men, Keith Dwayne Nelson in August and William Emmett LeCroy Jr. in September, into the death chamber, into the very house, the very room where the government murdered these 2 men, 2 of the 13.
And through the execution, correct? You were there. You didn't just leave.
So for every one of the executions, the Terre Haute Death Penalty Resistance, along with other organizers, partners such as Death Penalty Action and Indiana Abolition Coalition, we gathered in the afternoon and early evening every single time an execution was scheduled. We gathered in vigil, we gathered in prayer, we gathered with signs that said, "Stop the killing, end the slaughter, stop state violence," and on and on. We gathered with signs that memorialized the victims of these persons that were about to be executed. We heard from family members of persons about to be executed. We prayed, we sang, we chanted, we tolled the bell. We did whatever we could to say, hey, people, pay attention. Our government is killing somebody in our name. Our government is supposed to be a paragon of virtue, a democracy, supposedly valuing life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but not so true when you think about the amount of people incarcerated on death rows across this country.
We were talking about especially Will's journey and his spiritual journey. Do you think that, especially in these instances, right, we think of these as kind of worst case scenarios, is forgiveness possible?
Absolutely, forgiveness is possible. And from my understanding, that journey, it really begins with a person forgiving themselves. I mean, more than anything, we need to learn how to forgive ourselves, to seek the grace, seek God's grace to be able to forgive ourselves. And yes, we want forgiveness from others. But, before forgiveness happens, you need to acknowledge the harm. And at least in Will's experience and what he shared with me, some families just are not ready to do that. Families of the victims. Some have been. I've talked with persons whose family member was murdered and who did extend forgiveness to the murderer. Unfortunately, that person was still put to death, but with the firm protest of the victim's family member. So forgiveness is absolutely possible.
What do you mean by acknowledging the harm? What does that look like first, and why is that kind of a first step?
It's like what happened with, anyway, it's like what this nation, what settlers, colonizers did when this country was first being invaded by European colonizers. We harmed the native peoples here. And until we can acknowledge what we did was wrong, what we did caused great harm. So in the case of someone who takes another person's life, for Will, who was quite young at the time of his crime, to be able to say to the mother of the person whose life he took, to be able to have the opportunity to speak to her, to say, I acknowledge what I did was wrong, and how I hurt you, and how I took her life as, how deeply harmful that is, how violent that was. That's what we all think of. Anytime we are seeking forgiveness, whether it's in the privacy of the sacrament of reconciliation, or whether it's just with your friend when you said something wrong or hurt her feelings or hurt his feelings, you have to acknowledge. We know this, right? I'm sorry. I see I hurt your feelings. That's acknowledging harm.
I think there's kind of sometimes a belief or an understanding that forgiveness means saying, it's okay, you didn't actually hurt me. But that's not what you're telling me.
Not at all. Yeah, it's exactly right. That is not what I'm telling you. What I'm saying is, it's not okay what I did. I'm okay. It's not okay what I did. I acknowledge that I did the wrong thing. I acknowledge that I hurt you. Or in the case of such heinous crimes, and these guys have done some terrible, terrible things. To be able to say, I did this. I was violent. I took another person's life. I was totally out of my head, whatever, without without trying to make excuses, to just say, I am sorry. That acknowledges harm. Isn't that what we're taught as kids, most of us? That's the fertile ground for forgiveness to grow. It takes time, because forgiveness takes an openness of heart, takes a willingness to acknowledge our humanity, our common humanity. And it's not a matter of forgetting. It's not a matter of saying, oh, it's okay, you didn't mean it, or now I know, it's all right. You can never forget. My brother died in an accident he was 24 years old. It's not that I will ever forget that, nor do I want to forget it. But have I forgiven the industry that didn't have safety standards in place? He fell 30 feet off the top of a stage, on and on. Yeah, over time I came to forgive his employer who didn't have safety standards in place either, and on and on. Because really forgiveness is a gift we give to ourselves. One of the things that has surprised me, and some of this is like secondhand through the conversations, I've had with Keith and Will, lack of forgiveness can really eat a person up. And Keith talked about that, how persons can just go into a really deep, dark place. And just totally block out themselves as a human, and they, focus on all these other things. And really, that's just doing violence to themselves.
Yeah, is there anything else that you think is really important to know or to share to kind of, wrap us up here?
Well, I think it's helpful to know that the trend in this nation is against the death penalty. More and more states are abolishing the death penalty or have a moratorium, like the federal government now has a moratorium. Attorney General Merrick Garland put in place a moratorium soon after our current president was inaugurated. States that have the death penalty on the books, many of them have not executed anyone in years. So the trend is against killing people. And our church, the Catholic Church's teaching is that the death penalty is inadmissible. It's never right. That was a recent change in our catechism. And we're called to support life. And one of the ways we support life is by working to abolish the death penalty. So I encourage anybody that is looking for active engagement in living out their faith, look up like Catholic Mobilizing Network is a great place to start, or your own local or regional abolition group. The death penalty, we need to raise our voices against it. Our bishops in Indiana have spoken out against it. My community and other religious communities have. It needs to be brought to light just how violent it is. State-sponsored killing is never right. Whether it's on a city street at the hands of an angry mob or an angry police officer, or whether it's in the death chamber in Terre Haute, Indiana. We're better than that. The human community is better than that. We're all made in God's image, every single one of us, no exceptions. Okay, I think I'm done preaching.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
This episode of Good and Decent was produced by Josh Long, Jane O'Connor, Ryan Brossard, and Katie Rudder. Grotto Network is Javi Zubi Zaretta, Director, Josh Long, Senior Producer, Jesse McCartney, Senior Content Editor, Becky Rogers, Art Director, Mike Rossetti, Senior Manager for Community Engagement, Adrian Garaldi, Social Media Manager, Michaela Douglas, Web Content Strategist, Kevin DeClute, Video Producer, Jane O'Connor, Associate Video Producer.